She was 44 years old and 3 winters a widow when first we set eyes on Ravine Marsh. The town called her Ellie, standing just outside the Weathersford County Courthouse in Cold Creek, Wyoming, with $4.75 pressed into the lining of her glove, and not a single place to lay her head that wasn't owned by some man. The man who had cast her out was Calvin Doyle, the richest rancher in the valley, who had called in a debt her dead husband Tobias carried like a stone in his pocket and let it crush her the week they laid him in the ground. She had a rented cot in the back of Widow Prute's boarding house, a quilt her 2 grandmothers stitched together across 2 generations, a tin of buttons saved from her mother's wedding dress, and the small sum of money I just named. And on this morning she had ridden a borrowed mule out to the back lot of the courthouse, where the county was auctioning off 7 unclaimed lots and 1 rusted railroad boxcar that had stood half buried in the mouth of the Cold Creek Ravine since long before any of us were born. The bidding opened at $1. Ellie raised her hand at 4 and bought a boxcar for less than the cost of a good supper. Every man around her thought her touched. What was sealed inside had been waiting, patient, dry, silent, to change her life and the lives of 14 families besides. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Ravine Marsh. If you are watching tonight from a place that feels a little forgotten, we would love to hear about it in the comments below. Ravine grew up the eldest of 3 children, in a tight house on Lemp Avenue in South St. Louis, the daughter of a man named Henry Marsh, who clerked at Holton and priced dry goods from before daybreak until long past supper time 6 days a week, and whose notion of a Sunday well spent was to sit his children at the kitchen table and recite the multiplication tables until they could recite them back in any order he liked, forwards or sideways. Her mother was Mary Catherine, née Whitcomb, who could carry a tune like a thread through a needle, and who taught Ellie to darn a sock, so the mend was invisible, and to write her name in a hand that did not shake. There were 2 younger brothers, William, who died of diphtheria at 7 and was buried in a small pine box Henry painted himself on the kitchen floor, and Silas, who went off to the Klondike with a head full of fool gold and never wrote back. From Henry, Ellie learned that the world is a ledger, and that a ledger kept honestly is a kind of prayer, and that a number out of place, 1 cent, 1 row, 1 digit, is a small injustice that grows. From Mary Catherine, she learned that the languages of the body, starching a collar, brushing a horse, lifting a kettle without burning the wrist, are prayers too, and ought to be performed with the same quiet attention. She married Tobias Marsh at 19, which was not the man her parents had hoped, nor quite the man she had hoped either. He was a timber framer from Cold Creek, Wyoming, with hands like shovels and the patience it takes to square a beam against a chalk line all morning. He had come down to St. Louis on a freight run, stayed 3 days, and asked Ravine to come back with him. Henry said yes before Ellie could say no, because he had not been able to keep her younger brother alive and was glad, in his quiet way, to give an old age to the one daughter he could see the edges of. The train ride west took 4 days. She watched the country flatten from brick and chimney into brown grass and was quietly amazed at how far a person can run from themselves. In Cold Creek, she learned to live in a cedar log cabin on the south slope, with a tin roof that rang like a struck bell in summer hail, and a wood box Tobias, filled every Saturday before the light went down. She learned to cook on a cast-iron hearthstone that took 3 winters to season. She learned that the men who came home from the mine at 4 in the afternoon carried dust in their lungs, and that this dust was theirs, the way a man's name on a list is his, and that a mining company that refused to acknowledge the dust was a kind of thief, though no judge in Weathersford County would have called it so. Ellie was, by then, the clerk at Caldwell and Sons Mercantile, a position she would hold for 19 winters if the world had been a fairer place. She knew every price in the store. She could recite the contents of the warehouse without opening a single barrel. She had a memory for numbers the way her mother had a memory for tunes. Her reputation in Cold Creek was the kind a woman earns when she is precise without being proud. The schoolteacher sent his daughters to her to learn the entries of a journal before they went off to college in Laramie. The freighters on the long haul would stop at the store just to ask her what the winter wheat was running at, and to see, as one of them put it, a face that didn't lie about numbers. She never raised her voice at Tobias, and Tobias never raised his voice at her. They spoke in low tones across the kitchen table, and when one of them was wrong the other said so, and that was the end of it. They were not, by the world's reckoning, in love. They were two people who had figured out how to share a roof without either of them having to leave who they were. There is a small thing we want to record before we go on. When Ellie was 11, Henry made her balance her own ledger for the egg money Mary Catherine brought in from the backyard hens. He made her keep it in plain column, every entry dated, every sum verified by his hand. And once, the very first month, he caught her for a half-cent she'd carried forward because she did not want to tell her mother a hen had laid a soft-shelled egg and there was nothing to sell. He did not scold her. He took a piece of chalk and wrote on the kitchen board, "Half a cent is half a lie." Ellie was 38 when she remembered that board, and 44 when she saw her father's handwriting again. And we will come back to that, because what was sealed in the freight car depended on a person who could read numbers the way a hymn is read, and that kind of reading was her inheritance, and her only inheritance that no man had yet foreclosed upon. The fall of Eleanor Marsh is the fall of a great many women in the American West in those years, and although her particulars were her own, the shape of her fall was not. It begins, as these things often do, with a man's lungs. Tobias came home from the mine one Tuesday in February of 1921 with a cough that would not stop at the door. A deep, wet cough that sounded, in the kitchen, like someone trying to bring up a stone he had swallowed in his sleep. He coughed through supper. He coughed through the night. In the morning, Ellie set out a fresh bottle of the syrup Dr. Halsey had given her for Silas's pleurisy years before. By the next Tuesday, Tobias had coughed so much blood into his handkerchief that the handkerchief would not wash clean. Dr. Halsey came out on horseback in a wind that cut like wire and tilted his head at the listening horn. He stayed a long time. He spoke kindly. He spoke quietly. He told Ellie what every woman in Cold Creek already knew, which was that the dust of the Doyle mine made widows the way autumn made leaves, and the only cure was daylight, and daylight had not worked for any man in recent memory. Tobias worked a few more months. He could not square a beam against a chalk line the way he used to. He coughed up the chalk white against the board. He came home early, lay down on the kitchen floor with his coat still on, and asked Ellie to bring him the glass of milk she'd been pouring him since he was 30. He did not want to die. He wanted to finish the porch rail he'd been building for the cabin. He wanted to see the cottonwoods on the south slope turn gold in October. He wanted to meet his sister's first baby, which was due in March. He did not want to leave Ellie alone in a world that ate widows as wolves eat yearling does. But the cough went ahead of all his wishes. He died on the third Tuesday of October with the cottonwoods beginning, and his sister Ruth's baby arrived 3 weeks later, healthy and dark-haired, and Ellie was not there to see. That very same week, Calvin Doyle sent his man, a fellow named Brennan, a quiet sort who said yes to everything, and whose name was on nobody's lips unless the sheriff was, to call on Ellie at the cabin with a folded paper. The paper said Tobias Marsh had taken a loan of $312 against the cabin, the quarter horse, and the South Slope claim, signed in his own hand in the courthouse 4 winters back, witnessed by a clerk whose name was illegible. The paper called for repayment on the death of the borrower. The cabin, the quarter horse, and the South Slope claim passed, by the clean mechanics of a deed, into the hands of Calvin Doyle. Brennan did not speak above a murmur. He set the folded paper on the kitchen table beside the kettle and left. The kettle was still warm. Tobias had not been dead 3 hours. We could be angry on your behalf. We will not be. We will just say what happened. Ellie spent the next 18 months in a kind of slow destruction. The way a fence post rots at the soil line and stands upright above it, looking decent to anyone who isn't watching the base. She lost the cabin within the season. She lost the quarter horse in the spring, to a buyer Brennan brought around at a price that was not a price. She lost the South Slope claim, which she did not at first understand was a thing that could be lost, until she saw Doyle's cattle on it. She moved into Widow Prout's boarding house, and she was allowed to keep her trunk and the quilt and the tin of buttons, because a man's honor in 1922 was a soft and strange thing, and Doyle's honor allowed her those. There were 2 winters after that. In those 2 winters, Ellie kept the clerk's chair at Caldwell and Sons because old Mr. Caldwell liked her and because, in those years, a man could like a woman and not be ruined. The store had a tin cup she drank her coffee from, and she kept a small notebook in which she recorded every sale, every credit, every dollar that changed hands. She was $4.75 short of being able to set herself up somewhere, could have bought a small claim on the Eastern Plain, or a milk cow and a corner of barley. When, in the 3rd winter just past, Mr. Caldwell lost the store to his own creditors, and the tin cup and the notebook were no longer hers to fill out. That was the winter that put Ellie Marsh outside the Weathersford County Courthouse with $4.75 in her glove, and a borrowed mule, and nowhere to sleep. She had been a clerk for 19 winters. She had been a wife for 24. She was at 44 as close to nothing as a person can be in America, which is a country that has very particular ideas about what nothing looks like. She had one friend in Cold Creek who spoke to her in those years with any regularity, and that was Hattie Boyd, the schoolteacher, who was herself a widow of 40, and who lived in 2 rented rooms above the feed store with a wolfhound she had rescued from a bankrupt sheepherder. Hattie would knock on the door of Widow Prout's boarding house on Saturday afternoons and bring a jar of preserved peaches she'd put up in August, and she would sit on the edge of Ellie's cot, and they would speak of nothing very much, because a person who is at the bottom of a thing does not want to be spoken down to. They were not, by any worldly measure, in a position to change their own circumstances. They did not yet know what was sealed inside the freight car Ellie would buy in 2 days, and which Hattie would help her read. Let us now go to that purchase. The county auctioneer was a man named Pratt, who had been selling unclaimed things in Cold Creek for almost as long as there had been unclaimed things to sell. He was a small man with a frozen mustache, and he stood atop a feed box in the courthouse lot, and called the lots out in a voice that could not be heard past the 2nd row. The 7 parcels of land were absorbed within the hour, at prices varying from $18 to $240, mostly bought by Doyle's man Brennan, whose silence at these events was a kind of signature. The 8th lot, the freight car, had been difficult to get anyone to bid on. Pratt had put it up 3 winters running. He had called it a landmark, a curiosity, an eyesore. He had called it a hazard and a thing to be rid of. He had not called it valuable, because nobody in Cold Creek had ever seen it as a thing worth valuing. It stood where it had always stood, half out of the earth at the rim of the Cold Creek ravine, the way it had been left by the Bull Creek flood of '34, the same flood that had torn the old freight spur off its ties and dropped the car into the ravine like a coin into a jar. That was the better part of 90 winters ago, by the reckoning of old Elias Prouty, the freighter, who was 71 that spring and who had been told the story by his own grandfather, told to him by his own. The rail car was a thing the town walked past the way a person walks past an old stone wall. They did not see it as a wall, only as a thing that had been there. Ellie did not know what she was doing. Let us say that plainly. She did not buy the freight car because she had a plan. She bought it because the bidding opened at $1, and because she had been a clerk long enough to know that things no one else will touch at $1 are sometimes worth $5 to a person willing to be patient. She bought it because her father had been a clerk who never passed up a row of mismatched buttons. She bought it because she was tired of being nothing, and a person who is tired of being nothing will sometimes reach for the cheapest thing in the room and put it in her pocket, the way a child picks up a single pebble on a long road. The bidding went to $1. Pratt looked around. He called 2. He looked again. He looked at Ellie. She raised her hand at 4. Pratt said 4 once. He said 4 twice. He said sold, in a voice that cracked a little on the last syllable, as if he were surprised to be saying it to a woman. The freight car came out of the ravine 3 days later, hauled up by a team of mules belonging to Hattie's brother-in-law, who did not say much and who took his pay in hickory smoked sausage. The car was rusted through in 3 of its 4 corners. Its wheels were nearly gone. Its roof had caved in along the eastern length and now looked like a tired back. Its doors, hinged at the eastern edge, could not be opened by any 2 men who tried. Ellie pried them open with a tire iron she bought for 9 cents from Caldwell's successor. And on the 3rd morning of working in a thin sleet, the doors creaked open, and a smell came out, a smell of dry pine and dust, the smell of a room that had been closed against weather for 100 winters. Inside, packed tight against the eastern wall, beside a collapsed crate of blasting caps that had gone damp and silent decades ago, was an iron strongbox. It was roughly the size of a footlocker, painted a green so dark it was almost black, with a hinged lid and a lock the size of a closed fist. The lock was rusted shut, but the rust was the rust of a thing cut off from moisture and oxygen, and the slow tide of weather dry rust, the rust that crumbles under patience. Ellie did not have a key. She worked the lock with a hairpin Hattie supplied, and after a long hour the lock yielded with a faint but very definite click, the way a clock clicks when a man opens the case to clean it. Inside the strongbox were 3 things. The first was a leather-bound ledger, 3 inches thick, with the words Cold Creek Mining Cooperative, receipts and transfers, 1833-1834 stamped in gilt on its cover, the gilt not quite tarnished because the air inside the strongbox had been sealed and dry. The second was a sheaf of folded papers, in triplicate, each one sealed with a wafer of red wax, each bearing signatures and a notary's mark. The third was a single envelope, sealed with the same wax addressed, in a hand that Alina had not seen before, but that, in the way of a person who has spent 19 winters writing alongside a learned man, she could tell at once was the hand of someone trained in the same school her father taught, a hand that kept its numbers even and its letters leaning a little forward, the way a man leans forward to hand a thing to you. The hand belonged to a man named Josiah Trevors, a young Quaker out of Chester County, Pennsylvania, who had come over the plains in the spring of 1833 with a leather satchel and a distrust of corporations, and who had, by the autumn of that year, organized 38 working miners of Cold Creek into a cooperative that each man called simply the Pool. Each man had paid in his season's labor. Each woman had paid in her season's patience. The cooperative had opened a commissary of its own, weighted its own flour, filed its own claim at the territorial capital, and had kept, in this leather ledger, a clean and honest accounting of every share it held in trust for the families who were its members. We will not name every page, but we will name what was on the pages that mattered. The Pool had held in common, in the language of the ledger, 1/7 of every seam, 7th interest stakes in the commissary. And this is the part the years had not been able to take, a fund of 476 acres of grazing land around the Cold Creek Ravine, to be held in perpetuity for the use of member families, and to be divided at such time as the cooperative lawfully dissolved. The cooperative had, in fact, lawfully dissolved in the autumn of 1834, when Josiah Trevors had died of the cholera that came upriver with the year's first steamboat, and the remaining members, exhausted, half bankrupt, half widowed, had walked the assets to the territorial capital to be placed, as Josiah had written it in his last instruction, in the keeping of such officer as the territory shall name, until the Pool be reorganized, or until such a quorum of the member families now in residence shall by their own hands claim. The wagon that had carried the strongbox to the territorial capital had not arrived. The Bull Creek flood of 1834 had taken it at the ford, and the strongbox had rested, sealed and silent, in the freight car at the mouth of the ravine, while the pool was forgotten, and the territory became a state, and the state became weathered, and the people who should have made the claim died and had children who should have made the claim and did not make it, the way a letter goes undelivered across generations, addressed at last to a name none of them remembered. There was one more thing in the strongbox, and it is the thing that did most of the work that winter. The sheaf of folded papers, in triplicate, each signed in Josiah Trevor's hand and witnessed by two other hands, were the original transfer deeds of the 476 acres. And among those 476 acres, listed by metes and bounds in a script no longer than the width of a man's open palm, was the south slope of the valley. The very south slope her husband Tobias had claimed. The very south slope Calvin Doyle had taken from her on the morning of Tobias's death. Eleanor sat a long time on an overturned crate by the open freight car. She did not cry. She had not cried in 3 winters, and she was not about to begin over a piece of paper in a strongbox that smelled of dry pine. She sat, and she read the entries again, and she made small checks against the names she knew. The Whitcombs were on the list. Marsh was not, because no Marsh had been in the valley yet. Her husband's family had come west 20 winters later, but her great-grandmother Phoebe Whitcomb was, under her maiden name of Phoebe Dunham, with a dividend balance of $19 and a quarter-acre share in the South Slope. Phoebe had died in 1871 before Ellie was born. Phoebe had never claimed. Phoebe's descendants, 3 generations downstream, most of them gone east, several of them dead, 2 of them living today in Cold Creek, including Ellie's cousin Roy Whitcomb, who had been too addled by whiskey to read a deed in his own hand if it had been served to him on a plate, had never claimed either. But the deed did not say the descendants had to claim. The deed said a member family by their own hands, and Ellie Marsh, née Whitcomb of Cold Creek, Wyoming, was the great-great-granddaughter of Phoebe Dunham, and she was, at 44, with $4.75 in her glove, about to claim. Let us speak for a moment of what Eleanor felt. There is in the West a particular shame that is not the shame of the cities, and it is the shame of knowing a small thing that could be of use to one, and of having nobody to whom to bring it. Ellie had a ledger. She had a deed. She had a name that matched. She had a math. She did not have a courthouse, and she did not have a judge, and she did not have a single lawyer in Cold Creek who was not on Calvin Doyle's tab. She did not have money to bring a lawyer in from anywhere else. She had Hattie Boyd, who could read but not law. She had old Elias Prouty, who knew every foxhole in the county and the date of every flood since the year of his baptism. She had her own memory of her father's chalkboard. Half a cent is half a lie, which she had carried across the better part of her life and would carry to the end of it. She went home that evening and slept, for the first time in 3 winters, the way a person sleeps who has been told, in a place she was not looking, what it is she is to do tomorrow. And what she was to do took its time, because what she had to do was, in its face, opposed to Calvin Doyle. We will speak of him now because we have not until this moment spoken of his standing in the valley. Calvin Doyle was 58 that winter. He had lived in Cold Creek since he was 26. He had married no one, had buried no one, and had sired a son he had not seen in 14 winters. The boy had gone off to Denver to read for the law and had come back last summer to say he was not going to read for the law and was not going to come back. It had been the first piece of news about Calvin Doyle that did not, somehow, work in Calvin Doyle's favor. He had, at the moment of Tobias's death, 86,000 acres, 900 head of cattle, 4 mills, 2 banks, and a seat on the territorial council that he had not bothered to use in 15 winters because the men around the table knew the price of his silence and were not inclined to forget. He was a calm man. He did not threaten. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to raise his voice. He had made a science of the tone below a whisper, the tone a man uses to say a thing that is true the way a stove is hot, and he was the most dangerous man in Weathersford County because not one of his neighbors could produce, in writing, a single word he had ever said against another living person. When Alina Marsh entered the territorial courthouse in Cheyenne with her ledger and her deeds, filed them in the office of a clerk named Holcomb, who took them under advisement, and asked the court to appoint a referee to go over the holdings and to call, in the local newspaper, for any member of the pool or any descendant of a member of the pool to come forward. Doyle heard of it in a day. He heard of it because the clerk Holcomb was a man who drank with Doyle's man Brennan on Tuesdays at the Broken Wheel Saloon in Pine Bluff, and there are some friendships that pay better than others. Doyle did not, at first, take action. He sat in his boardroom above his bank in Cold Creek and listened, the way a man listens to thunder he has been expecting, and he thought. He thought for 7 days. He thought in particular about the South Slope, which was not on his books, a piece of land he had acquired lawfully. It was a piece of land he had acquired because a widow had no lawyer. He understood the difference between the two kinds of acquisition, and he understood, the way a horse understands a rail it has gone under, that one of the two kinds will hold up in court and the other will not. He sent Brennan to the widow Prute's boarding house on the 8th day. Brennan knocked. Ellie opened the door. Brennan did not speak above a murmur. He set a folded paper on the kitchen table beside the kettle, and this paper was a deed to a small parcel, a quarter horse and 12 acres, and a stipend of $150, payable on acceptance, with a clause typed into the bottom that said, in the plain language of a man who had understood the country well, acceptance of this deed is acceptance of all prior claims under the pool. Alina read the paper. She set it back down by the kettle. She said, in a voice that surprised her, no. Brennan did not blink. He left the paper where it lay. He left. In 10 days the second paper came. It was a deed to the whole South Slope, with a stipend of $1,200. Acceptance is acceptance of all prior claims under the pool, same clause, same language. Alina read the paper. She set it back on the table. She said she would take it under advisement, which is a phrase that means a person has read the paper and understands it, and is letting the man on the other side of the paper wait. She did not take it under advisement. She slept on it. She did not sign it. She wrote, on the back of a flour sack in Hattie's clear hand, a short paragraph saying that on this date she had received the paper from Mr. Brennan on behalf of Mr. Doyle, that she had been offered the South Slope under the condition named, and that she had not signed, and that she would not sign, and that a copy of this paragraph had been sent by her own hand, in the post, to the clerk Holcomb at the territorial courthouse. She signed the paragraph. She signed the envelope. She walked the envelope 11 blocks to the post office. She walked back. She ate bread with Hattie, who had brought a fresh jar of peaches. And now we come to the winter of the matter, which began on a Tuesday in early March at the territorial courthouse in Cheyenne, in a wood-paneled courtroom of no particular grandeur, under a judge named Hanlon, who had been a circuit rider in his younger days, and who had a habit of taking off his spectacles and putting them back on in such a way as to give a witness to understand he was being heard and weighed. Old Elias Prouty appeared, in an overcoat of his grandfather's, and gave a 30-minute account of the flood of 1834 with the precision of a man who had heard the account 60 winters ago and had decided to remember it exactly. Hattie's brother-in-law appeared and gave a 15-minute account of how the freight car had been hauled from the ravine, and of the strongbox, and of the smell of dry pine. 2 other descendants appeared. Roy Whitcomb, sober for the second time in 7 winters because Ellie had put him on a horse that morning and given him a coffee and a piece of bread, and the firm promise that he would be looked after, and a widow named Gustina Lemp, 81 years of age, who had ridden to Cheyenne on the omnibus because her great-grandfather had been a member under the name of Jabez Lemp. Alina took the stand. She did not speak above a murmur. She did not weep. She did not dramatize. She set the ledger on the rail of the witness stand and let the judge take it. She set the deeds on the rail of the witness stand and let the judge take them. She said, in the calm tone of a clerk recording a sale, what was in them, what the names meant, what the meets and bounds meant, how the South Slope had been transferred to Calvin Doyle by what may have looked like a sale but had not in fact been a sale. She answered questions. She answered more. The judge took off his spectacles. He put them back on. He took the ledger to his chambers. He did not return to the courtroom for 40 minutes. When he returned, he was the same judge who had gone out. He was not, however, the kind of judge who had gone out. He gave his ruling in a voice not above a murmur of his own. The pool, he said, was a lawful association. The dissolution had been lawful. The transfer of assets to the territory had been lawful. The strongbox had been lawfully entrusted. The 476 acres were held in perpetual trust for the member families and for the descendants of member families now residing in Cold Creek. The South Slope was, by the original deed, in the trust. Its transfer to Calvin Doyle had not been lawful. Calvin Doyle held no interest in it he was entitled to keep. The territorial treasurer was ordered to administer the trust. The estate of Calvin Doyle on this and on the other parcels was quieted. 14 families were named in the decree. Each family received, on a schedule set by the court, a portion of grazing land and a small stipend for the wrongs visited upon them by the failure of administration. We will not pretend that Calvin Doyle became, on the day after the ruling, a smaller man than he had been the day before. He was smaller in the only sense the law allows, which is the sense that the land he had thought he owned he did not, and the cattle he had pastured on it would not be pastured on it next spring, and the silence he had spent a lifetime buying wood, the morning of the next Tuesday at the Broken Wheel Saloon, no longer be available for purchase. Brennan came to the courthouse 3 days later with a deed of receipt for the parcels named in the ruling. He was civil. He was courteous. He was the same quiet sort who had set the folded papers on the widow Prute's kitchen table, and he was, perhaps for the first time in our remembering him, a man in a difficult position, because the law was no longer buying the silence he had been keeping. He set the deed down on the rail of the window in the clerk's office and left without speaking. Let us name what was restored. We will name only what was of the heart, because the dollars are a clerk's work and we are not clerks, and we have not been one much. Ellie received the South Slope. She received, in addition, an appointment as administrator of the trust, at a stipend of $100 a winter, which was, in 1922, the sum a person could live on if she was the kind of person who knew how to live on $100 a winter. Roy Whitcomb received his great-grandmother's quarter-acre on the South Slope, and the dividend of $19 his great-grandmother had carried in the pool's column and had died without claiming. He paid a visit to Ellie on the Sunday after the ruling and kissed her on the cheek, and he did not drink for the rest of the winter. Gustina Lemp received a 2-acre parcel on the Eastern Plain and a stipend of $48, which was, as she put it when she spoke to her nephew by letter, the kind of letter that arrives once in a generation. 13 other families received, in parcels and dividends small and larger, the partial restoration of a thing they had not known they had lost. Hattie Boyd did not receive a parcel. She received the satisfaction of a woman who had sat at the kitchen table late in the evenings and translated difficult passages for a friend, and who understood, the way a person understands a long winter, that the satisfaction was the parcel. Let us go back now to the opening lines of what we have told you, because every story we tell on these pages makes its sense at its end, and we would not send you away without the sense. We began with Eleanor Marsh at 44, standing outside the Weathersford County Courthouse with $4.75 in her glove, having just bought a freight car that no man wanted at $4. We said she had been a clerk for 19 winters. We said she had been a wife for 24. We said she had been at the bottom of a thing the way a fence post is at the bottom of a fence post, looking decent if you did not watch the base. We said she had a memory for numbers the way her mother had a memory for tunes, and that this memory was the inheritance no man had foreclosed upon. We said the freight car had stood half buried in the ravine for 90 winters, and that what was sealed inside had been waiting to change her life and the lives of 14 families. Now we tell you the meaning. The freight car had stood, patient and silent, the way all useful things stand when no one is looking. Alina had walked up to it the way a person walks up to the cheapest thing in the room. The strongbox had kept its seal the way a kept promise keeps its seal. The ledger had been, at the bottom of its pages, the record of a small commonwealth, the pool, which had been honest in its time and had not been honest with, because the man who was to carry it forward had died of cholera and the flood had taken the wagon. The pool had trusted Alina, 90 winters later, the way the river trusts the ground it finds at the end of a long dry season, and Alina had been trusted back. The way a person is trusted when the thing she is trusted with is a kind of legacy she did not know she deserved. Half a cent, her father had told her at the kitchen table, is half a lie. Ellie had kept her half-cent for 19 winters, and when it came time to set it on the rail of a witness stand for the seeing of a judge, she set it there in a copper half-cent she had been carrying in her pocket for 10 winters, and it was, in the way her father meant, a kind of prayer. Alina Marsh is 46 now, and she sleeps in a small cabin on the south slope her husband claimed, which she claimed after him, and which no man will claim after her without her asking. The freight car stands in her dooryard on a foundation of new-cut cedar, the rust brushed off, the doors oiled back, a small lantern inside. The strongbox sits inside it open, the ledger in its place. She does not show it to anyone who does not ask. She shows it to anyone who asks. She has an old rocking chair by the door, and on Saturday afternoons in summer she sits in it with Hattie beside her, and the two women drink weak coffee, and they do not speak of the pool. They speak mostly of nothing, the way a person speaks of nothing when she has, at last, something to be silent about. Settle in, if you have not already, and let us thank you for spending a long evening with Alina Marsh. We are grateful, as always, for the long, quiet evenings you spend with us. If this story stirred something in you, a memory of a thing you once found where no one was looking, or a friend who taught you a small practice that turned out to be a kind of prayer, we would be honored if you would share it in the comments, so that another traveler at midnight may find a small warmth in a stranger's words. We will leave you with one question tonight, and the question is this. What is a time you found value in something others wrote off? A row of mismatched buttons, a letter that had gone undelivered, a strongbox at the bottom of a ravine in a country you had been told was empty. Until next time, stay close.